Do you have a story you'd like to hear featured on the channel? Well, good news. You can go to mariesfield.com and send it my way. And of course, thank you. Back in the 80s, my parents were living in Venezuela with my maternal grandparents. But when they found out my mom was pregnant with their first kid, me, they wanted to make a better life for themselves. So with my grandparents' encouragement, they moved to the States. They moved around a bit, starting in California, since my dad already had family living there. Then we ended up making our way to Montana, where they eventually settled for good. After I was born, they had my little brother a few years later. So, at the ages of 8 and 3, they took us back to visit Venezuela and meet our grandparents and our other family for the first time. It was a lot of fun from what I remember. There were a lot of cousins around my age, and we all had a blast. We played kickball, and I remember climbing this huge tree in my grandparents' backyard and just laid around on the branches, laughing at a few of the younger cousins that couldn't reach us. I remember eating way too many of these little pies that my grandma made herself. They had some kind of fruit glaze inside and were sprinkled with cinnamon on top. I have no idea what she called them, I could never remember, but they were phenomenal. I didn't want to leave when we did. After we got back, my parents promised that we would go at least once a year, and even told us maybe when I had asked if we could move there, not having any sense of distance and the difference between a state and country move. All I knew was, as a kid, I loved it. Unfortunately, things happened and we weren't able to go back there the next year, but then we did the year after when my little sister was born. It was just as much fun that year as it was the last time. It would be a few more years before we were able to go again, but we did have some family come and visit us, which was also a lot of fun. After then, my parents had 2 more kids, and they decided it would be too expensive and not safe to travel with 5 kids and only 2 adults, so we stopped going as a family. I went one more time with just my dad when my paternal grandfather passed away. Of course, it wasn't all for fun, but it was still great seeing some of my family that I had only talked to on the phone or by email. After that, we pretty much stopped going. We went on vacations as a family in the States, but it just wasn't the same. I had fun with my siblings, but there was such a strong family connection between all the aunts, uncles, and cousins and traditions that I really hung on to and knew that when I was capable to do so, I knew I would return on my own. That way, I could do what I wanted, however long I wanted to while I was there, and that was exactly what I set out to do. In my early 30s, I had completed my college degree and had a pretty steady job working my way into the position that I wanted. The place I worked for had great pay and benefits, as well as vacation time. And since I didn't have a family or even a significant other at this point, I decided I would make my vacation time useful and go on my Venezuela trip. My closest cousin and one of my best friends, Daniela, was going to be turning 34, so I thought it would make for a great surprise to show up, and then we could all go out and have fun. I talked with my parents about it, as I at least wanted someone to know where I was, and I would prefer having a ride to the airport, and they loved the idea. They helped me with the locations and where the safest areas to stay were. They were adamant someone would let me stay with them, but I didn't want to be an unexpected guest, and I still wanted to be able to explore on my own, so I wanted to find a hotel, and I got it all booked and paid for. The time finally came for my trip, and my parents took me to the airport, but made me stuff some extra things in my case to give to people. It was a little nerve-wracking, as I had never flown alone, and I had a layover, so I had to check in, board, all of it on my own, and quickly, but I did it with minimal delays. When I arrived, I got a ride from the airport to the hotel, which was about 45 minutes away, and checked in as normal. Now, I will say here, I do speak Spanish. I wasn't perfectly fluent at it, but I knew enough that I could hold a conversation, talk to people at the airport, on the bus, the receptionist, and tell them about me, things like that. I just sometimes get tripped up on less common words or phrases. However, I think I surprise people when they realize I do speak Spanish, such as the hotel receptionist. She lightened up quite a bit with me when I did and even gave me some great suggestions on places to visit and areas to avoid. As we all do in the States, I had been told by both my parents and this lady of certain little areas to stay clear from, as it was nothing but trouble. I got to my room though, and it was very beautiful. It had an older theme to it, but was very comfortable to be in. I called my parents once I checked in and decided to freshen up before I went to my cousin's. After a few hours, I finally made my way over to their place. I was able to get a bus that took me most of the way, then a cab to take me the rest of the way. Just as expected, they were beyond ecstatic to see me. I'm sure part of them was hoping to see the whole family, which I would have loved to be able to do, but we all still enjoyed our time together. We must have sat and talked for hours, going through photos, little trinkets, and memorable items and times, and then swapping gifts. By then, it was already getting late, so I ended up getting dinner for all of us, and they gave me a ride back to my hotel after offering to have me stay with them. We agreed to meet up the next day, and Daniela and I were going to go around the area for some sightseeing. Daniela was up and at my room early the next day, barely giving me enough time to get ready before she yanked me out of my room. We had a great day though. She took me to an old movie theater and a park that we went to as kids. We went shopping and even went to a nice place to eat. There were so many memories brought back in one day. It was incredible. The next day was her birthday, and after having a celebration with the family, we were going to go out and have some fun together. The next day went as planned too. We had a party at her place as she was still living with her parents, my aunt and uncle. Then after they settled in for the night, we headed out. She said she knew a good place we could go to party, as she had been there plenty of times, and even joked about finding a guy there. When we got there, I was a little surprised by the way it looked, but I trusted Daniela since she said she had been there many times before. It quite honestly looked like a shack with a shoddy extension built on the side to extend the size of the place. There were a few people standing around outside, smoking that seemed a little sketch, but upon approaching them, they were all very friendly. Everyone was well-mannered, most spoke Spanish, but also some English, which helped me a bit too. There were a few people there that Daniela knew already, so she introduced me to her friends. We all had a great time, and I tried drinks that I had never heard of or tried in the States, which probably also affected my ability to think clearly, I'm sure. After some time, I felt like I was going to just collapse with how exhausted I was. Somehow, Daniela looked like she still had hours left in her. I didn't want to leave her, but since she seemed to have friends around, I was less worried about it. I told her in order for me to be able to function whatsoever the next day, I was going to have to head back to my hotel. She understood, so I hugged her and headed out the front. One of the older guys out there, old enough to be my father, I'm sure, offered to give me a ride back. He was really nice and didn't give off any weird vibes, but I declined, saying I didn't want to be a bother and insisted I would get a cab. He understood, told me to be safe, and I continued walking towards the street to see if I could wave a cab to stop. There were a few that would drive around the area, but you could also call to get one. After waiting a few and none driving by, I finally called the company I went through to get one. Shortly after, a car pulled up, came to a stop, and I got in. He asked me for the location, and after I told him, he headed off as normal. I was pretty bad at small talk, unless they brought it up, so I sat there quietly for a few. Not long into the drive, though, the driver asked me if I was going to be here long, and if I was there for work or personal. All of this conversation is taking place in English as well. Again, for the most part, people have been very friendly and welcoming, so I didn't find it hard to talk to this guy either. I told him I lived in the US, but I was here visiting family. Then he started asking odd questions like if I was staying alone or if someone was waiting for me, how long I was going to be here, if I had any other plans while I was here, and other more prying questions. Even being under the influence, something didn't seem right. I started making my answers shorter and shorter and kind of looking around to see if I recognized any buildings or landmarks to tell me how close we were, but that's when I noticed I didn't have a clue where I was. Nothing looked familiar, and there were very few streetlights. Then he excused himself from the conversation, saying he had to take a call, which is when I noticed he had an earpiece in. When he took the call, though, he spoke in Spanish. I was relieved to be done with the conversation, but that didn't really mean I was out of the conversation. I started hearing some alarming things being talked about, just by my driver, and I pretended to not know what he was saying. As mentioned, my Spanish isn't the best, but I knew enough to understand things like young, American, pretty, small, should be easy, how much, not enough, where to drop, and similar startling phrases. Again, I was trying to not look afraid, and I took out my phone to start texting everything I could about where we were, what this guy looked like, and what was being said. That's when I noticed the guy was looking over at my phone to try and see what I was doing. Again, I was just trying to be sly about it all, so I was looking over at him in my peripheral, and I caught a glimpse of something shiny next to him. Almost like it was in his pocket or belt loop maybe. I could see a handle sticking out, and it looked like a weapon. I'm pretty sure it was a knife. I quickly tried to send what I had already to Daniela when the car came to a stop. It was at a crossroad, and there were some small homes on the side. I think the conversation with the person on the phone had ended because I noticed he wasn't talking to them anymore. That's when, without looking over at me, he asked me if I knew Spanish. It may have been stupid, but I decided to respond in Spanish. If you let me out of here, you'll never see me again, and I will tell no one. We seemed to sit in silence for what seemed like forever until he finally drove off, with me still in the car. At this point, I thought I blew it and started dialing 171 when he stopped in front of a building that looked like a hospital or a clinic of some sort. He got out of the car, walked around to my side and opened the door and leaned in and said, "Americans are more trouble anyways." Then he stood up with his hand on his weapon and motioned for me to get out. I quickly darted out of the car and into the building, watching from inside as he got back in and took off. I just stood there terrified that he may come back until someone came around and tapped me on my shoulder. She asked me if I was okay, and I said yes, and asked if I could stay here until my friend picked me up, and she agreed. She looked around outside and seemed a bit hesitant, so I told her in Spanish, "Please, I just need a safe place. I won't be a bother." And she seemed to understand. She had me sit in the waiting room while I called my cousin. She got my messages, thankfully, and did try calling back, but since my mind was all over the place, I had missed the call. I finally got a hold of her, and she was yelling at me, terrified as she had driven to my hotel, and I wasn't answering, and the front desk said they hadn't seen me either. I described where I was, and then she talked to the lady that let me stay there and figured out where I was and came and picked me up. Before I left, The lady told me I was brave and lucky to have escaped. In Spanish, she said something about not being forgiving, I think. From there, Daniela insisted I stay with them at their place, and I agreed. It sucked, I was going to lose money, but the guy knew where I was staying, and I didn't like that thought. So we went back up to my room together to get my stuff, and then we went to her place. I kept apologizing because I felt like I cut her birthday short for being so naive, but she laughed and said that other than being scared she may have gotten me kidnapped, that was the most fun she had in a while. She told me about the scary side of Venezuela and how there had been abductions, so she too was surprised they let me go and couldn't make sense of it, but we tried not to dwell on it. We decided to keep it to ourselves because we didn't want any of our parents to be afraid or not want us to do anything else like this, but we didn't take it lightly. For the rest of the week I was there, I never traveled alone. I was always with someone I trusted or made sure there was plenty of people around, and I got some pepper spray to at least give me a fighting chance. Thankfully, the rest of the trip was still a lot of fun and no more risky situations. I've gone back once since then, and Daniela has also stayed with me in the States, and she had a blast as well. We just know now that when you travel somewhere you're not familiar with, anything could happen, so just stay safe, especially when you travel alone. When this story took place, I was around 15 years old. Back in my teenage years, I used to spend a lot of my summer break out fishing with my dad and uncle, and they knew all of the good spots to go, including some places that were on private property. My uncle lived out here, and he knew most of the people that owned the land, so for the most part, we were typically allowed to fish them without question. On this day, we had decided to go to one of the small ponds that was on the farm of my uncle's friend, and we decided that we were going to go early in the morning. Now, I hated these morning trips because I was a teenager, and I just wanted to sleep in until noon on my summer breaks, but you know how it goes. This pond was surrounded by a barbed wire fence, so it was definitely not in an area where people would be around it, but we had come in from the front of the property, so we had pretty easy access to it. Obviously, when we got to the water and started to get comfortable, there was nobody around. It was just the three of us. Things were going pretty well for the first couple of hours, but as the morning started to drive on, the bites were becoming less and less. I was pretty well focused on the water and my bobber, but I looked over and I noticed that my dad and uncle both had their lines out of the water, and they were whispering to each other. I couldn't hear what they were saying, so I asked if they were okay and what they were doing, and my dad told me not to worry about it. I just went back to watching my line and decided that it wasn't super important. After a few moments, my dad came back over and said that I needed to go ahead and reel in. I was confused because I figured that we were going to be there for a few hours more, but he told me that we needed to go ahead and head off. I got all my stuff together and got up, and I heard my dad say something like, "Where did he go?" My uncle looked around and said, "I don't see him anymore." I asked who they were talking about, and again, they both told me to hush. I was annoyed, sure, but again, I was 15. I just assumed that something was going on, and they didn't want to tell me. As we were walking back to the car, I heard what sounded like a seriously loud bang, almost like a really big firecracker going off nearby. As soon as it happened, my uncle and my dad grabbed me and jumped down into a small gully. I asked what was going on, and they ignored me again. After a few moments, my uncle said that we needed to leave the gear and run to the car. My dad agreed and told me to leave the fishing stuff. I was upset and told him that I didn't want to leave it behind, and he told me to just do it and that we would go back for it. For the sake of not just going on and on about this whole thing, We left the fishing gear and we made it back to the car and drove back to my uncle's friend's house. They were all talking in the living room and told me to just sit on the couch and not move. Then my uncle and his friend went back out on the property and both of them had guns. After they left, I basically told my dad that he needed to tell me what was going on, and he surprisingly did. He told me that while we were fishing, he noticed that there was some guy standing in the trees that was watching us. He just stood there for a while and didn't move, and then when my dad waved at him, he said that the guy brandished a gun. That was about the time that he said we needed to go ahead and leave. And then as we were walking back, that loud bang was apparently the guy shooting at us. Neither my uncle nor my dad knew who this guy was, and we were on private property that belonged to my uncle's friend, so there was no reason for anyone to approach us aggressively, much less shoot at us. After scouting the property, they said that they didn't find anyone, but they found a few spots where rounds had hit trees, and they weren't far off from where we were standing when the shots went off. Obviously, I was a bit freaked out and mad that my dad didn't tell me when it was happening, but I get it. It was pretty terrifying, and they never figured out who it was. We also never went back out to that pond, even though the person that owned the land added a better fence in the back area where the pond was. I think the whole thing just kind of got to my dad and uncle a bit too much for them to want to go back. Way back, whenever I was a little kid, my father loved to make it a point to be part of my life at every chance he could. I won't say that it was a permanent thing, as he and I don't really speak much anymore, but every summer up until I was 16, he made it a point to plan this super important camping trip with myself and my brother. My brother hated it. I absolutely loved it and would look forward to it literally every single year. My dad would plan a few days off from his job, make us pack up the essentials, and then on the day of the trip, we would get up at like 3 or 4 in the morning to drive the several hours to the same campground as every other year. He would always take us to the same location, and we would always camp in the exact same spot. From there, we would go fishing, hiking, nature watching, just everything like that you can do in nature. Now, like I said, my dad made it a point to do this with us. While we aren't on the same page anymore, and aren't on talking terms for a reason that are beyond the scope of this story, these days out in the woods are some of my most cherished core memories, and I will never forget how much fun I had doing all the things we did. Because I remembered how fun it was, I wanted to create the same memories and connection with my own son. So, when he was around 9 years old, I decided that we would plan to take a trip to the same campgrounds that my dad had taken me to. It took me a really long time to convince my wife that we should go camping, and when she finally agreed, she basically told me that if literally anything went wrong, we had to go home immediately. I relented because I knew that she wasn't going to budge on this, so I agreed and said that we would be super careful, and I promised that it would be a great time for all 3 of us. We got all of our stuff together, and we headed out onto the road. It was early enough that the summer sun wasn't quite beating down, but it was definitely starting to warm up. I could tell that she wasn't happy with the fact that it was likely going to be hot, but I told her that I couldn't control the weather, and that it would be a lot nicer in the evening. We got to the spot and got out of the truck, and I just kind of took a deep breath in while I stepped out onto the grass. The minute my eyes landed on that plot of land, a huge rush of nostalgia hit me, and I remembered all the times that my dad and I spent out here, fishing, bird watching, and just enjoying the summer days. We started to unpack and set up our tent, and I was telling my wife all about the things that I wanted to do while we were there. She said that she wanted to get some pictures of the birds out in the woods and that, despite the heat, she was pretty excited to spend some time out in the wilderness. After we got the tent set up and we were convinced that we were ready to camp, my wife asked if we could check out the surrounding area before the sun went down. I agreed. I was pretty psyched to see how much things had changed since I was last there. We started out into the woods, and my wife was taking pictures of everything she could find. She was taking pictures of literally everything she saw: deer, birds, squirrels. Then I noticed that she had paused while staring through the viewfinder of her digital camera. I asked her if she was okay or if there was something that she saw, and she said that there was something up ahead that she wanted to check out. We walked up to where she was pointing her camera, and I was pretty shocked by what we saw. Right in front of us was what looked like a 7-foot by 3 or 4 foot large rectangular area that looked like it had been dug up and refilled with dirt. It was pretty obviously recent, but it looked like it could have been a few days or maybe a couple of weeks since it was filled in. My wife asked if this was a camping thing, but I had a feeling it was something much, much worse. I told her that this was the one thing and that we needed to go ahead and pack up. She was a bit confused, but I mentioned that we needed to report this to the police. She didn't follow at first, but after we got the stuff in the car and were heading back out, I mentioned that what we saw was probably a grave. She went pale as a ghost and agreed that that was enough to cancel the trip. We reported it to the cops. I told them that we were out hiking in the area and that we found what looked like a grave. They said they would check it out, but obviously never told us anything more than that. We decided to make plans to do something else and to stay in a hotel for a couple of days and just go to the zoo instead of camping. I haven't been able to convince her to go camping ever since, but honestly, I can't blame her. So that, my friends, was a collection of scary summer stories. And I'm sorry for myself, summer in general is a scary story. Never been fond of summer or the heat, so I think the worst of it was back in 21, I believe, when our AC went out for a month, about a little over a month, I think. It was awful, not a good time. But I could probably complain a lot about the heat, so let me stop there. So if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like below. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, consider subscribing if you haven't already. And lastly, don't forget to leave a comment on your thoughts or let me know something that you do enjoy about summer or something you enjoy doing during the summer. And with that being said, friends, I hope you have a fantastic day and the rest of your week. And until next time, take care.